The Luftwaffe crews called them Nahtgespenster night ghosts. German bomber pilots flying over occupied Europe between 1943 and 1945 developed a fear unlike anything else they'd experienced in combat. It wasn't the flak bursts lighting up the sky or the searchlight batteries sweeping back and forth across the darkness. Those threats you could see, anticipate, maybe even evade. What terrified them was something far worse. An enemy that struck without warning from the absolute blackness, appearing only in the final seconds before cannon shells ripped through aluminum skin and shattered cockpit glass. Lieutenant Wilhelm Jonen, a Luftwaffe night fighter pilot who later wrote about his experiences, described what his fellow bomber crews reported. They spoke of being torn apart by an invisible opponent, of never seeing the enemy until it was too late, of watching their comrades' aircraft suddenly explode in midair with no warning whatsoever. The psychological impact was devastating. These weren't novice pilots. Many were veterans who'd survived years of combat over the Eastern Front and the Mediterranean. But this was different. This was being hunted in your own element by something you couldn't fight back against. The numbers tell the story better than words ever could. In early 1943, German bomber losses over Britain averaged around 3 to 4% per mission, acceptable by wartime standards if brutal. By late 1944, that figure had skyrocketed to nearly 20% on certain raids. One mission in March 1944 saw 37 German aircraft shot down in a single night. Most by night fighters, the crews never spotted until the moment of attack. Bomber Command's entire strategic doctrine was being threatened not by anti-aircraft guns or daylight interceptors, but by an enemy that had somehow mastered the darkness itself. What made these attacks so terrifying was their complete unpredictability. A German crew might be cruising at 20,000 AFT, engines droning steadily, when suddenly their aircraft would shudder under the impact of cannon fire. There'd be no engine sound warning them of an approaching fighter, no silhouette against the stars, no tracer rounds giving away an attacker's position during the approach. Just darkness, then violence, then often death. The few survivors who made it back described the same phenomenon. They were hit by something they never saw coming and couldn't understand. How do you defend against an enemy that can find you in total darkness across hundreds of miles of empty sky, but remains completely invisible until the moment it opens fire? The Germans tried everything. They installed rear warning radar sets. They varied their altitudes and routes constantly. They flew in defensive formations and trained their gunners to sweep the darkness endlessly, looking for any hint of movement. Nothing worked. The invisible enemy kept finding them, kept killing them, and kept disappearing back into the night without a trace. By 1944, Luftwaffe bomber crews were requesting transfers to daytime units, despite the American fighter escorts and mass defensive fire, because at least in daylight you could see what was trying to kill you. The night had become Britain's domain, and the RAF's night fighters had become something far more frightening than any conventional weapon. They'd become ghosts that could reach out and touch you in the dark. Britain's situation in 1940 looked catastrophic from the air. The Blitz had begun in September, and German bombers were crossing the English Channel almost every night with near impunity. London burned. Coventry was devastated on November 14, 1940, when 500 German aircraft dropped hundreds of tons of high explosives and incendiaries, killing over 500 civilians and destroying the city's medieval cathedral. Liverpool, Birmingham, Manchester all suffered under their relentless pounding of Luftwaffe bombers that operated in darkness as if it were broad daylight. The problem was brutally simple. Britain couldn't see its attackers. RAF Fighter Command had won the Battle of Britain during daylight hours, but night was another matter entirely. Traditional fighter tactics relied on visual identification, a pilot spotting an enemy aircraft against clouds or landscape, then maneuvering into firing position. In complete darkness at 20,000 FT, this was virtually impossible. Fighter pilots would be vetoed toward German bomber streams by ground controllers watching radar screens. But once they got close, they were on their own. They'd search the blackness desperately, hoping to spot an exhaust flame or a silhouette against the stars. Most times they saw nothing. The German bombers would complete their runs, drop their payloads, and disappear back across the channel untouched. The statistics were humiliating. In the early months of the Blitz, RAF night fighters were shooting down less than 2% of German raiders. Ground-based anti-aircraft fire accounted for most German losses, and even those numbers were minimal. The Luftwaffe was losing perhaps 10 to 15 aircraft per major raid, against forces of 300 to 500 bombers. It was barely a nuisance. British cities were being systematically destroyed while the RAF's fighter force, so effective in daylight, proved almost useless after sunset. Air Marshal Hugh Dowing, commander of Fighter Command, faced an impossible challenge. His Spitfires and Hurricanes had saved Britain during the day, but they were essentially blind at night. Pilots would take off, guided by searchlights and ground radar controllers who could see German formations on their screens. Controllers would vector fighters into the general area of bomber streams, calling out bearings and altitudes over crackling radio sets. Then pilots would begin the futile process of visually searching thousands of cubic miles of black sky for a single dark aircraft. It was like finding a specific grain of sand on a beach while blindfolded. Some pilots got lucky. Squadron leader John Cunningham, who would later become Britain's top-scoring night fighter ace, described his early night interceptions in late 1940. We'd be directed to within a mile or two of the bomber stream. Then it became pure chance. You'd see searchlights sweeping, perhaps catch a glimpse of something darker against the clouds, make a desperate turn, hoping to close the distance before you lost sight again. Most nights you'd land having seen nothing but darkness and exhausted yourself chasing ghosts. The few successful interceptions that did occur were celebrated like miracles because that's essentially what they were. Miraculous combinations of luck, skill, and geometry that brought hunter and prey together in the vast emptiness of the night sky. Britain needed a solution, and it needed one fast. The Blitz was destroying industrial capacity, killing civilians, and eroding public morale. Fighter Command had the aircraft and the pilots, but they needed eyes that could see in the dark. They needed technology that could turn night into day. The answer came from a cramped laboratory where scientists were working with radio waves in ways that seemed like science fiction. Airborne Interception Radar, AI for short, would transform night fighting from hopeless guesswork into precision hunting. The concept was straightforward. Mount a radar set inside a fighter aircraft that could detect other planes in the darkness, giving the crew electronic eyes that worked when human vision failed completely. The execution, however, was extraordinarily difficult. The first AI radar sets were primitive and temperamental. AI MC-3, introduced in early 1940, could theoretically detect aircraft at ranges up to 3 km. But in practice it was plagued with problems. The radar operator, called the navigator, or NAV in RAF terminology, sat behind the pilot, staring at a cathode ray tube that displayed glowing blips representing potential targets. Ground clutter made low-altitude interceptions nearly impossible, and the minimum range was around 400 ft, meaning operators lost contact just when pilots needed it most. Still, it was better than pure guesswork, and skilled teams began scoring occasional kills. Everything changed with AI MAC-FI in 1941. This system operated on a shorter wavelength around 1.5 meter instead of 6, which dramatically improved resolution and accuracy. Detection range extended to nearly 5 miles under ideal conditions, and minimum range dropped to under 300 ft. More importantly, the displays became easier to interpret. Instead of ambiguous blips, operators could distinguish between different types of returns and judge relative motion more accurately. A skilled radar operator could now guide his pilot through a complete intercept from initial detection to visual range, calling out corrections in bearing and altitude, while the pilot concentrated on flying. The breakthrough came from understanding how to present information effectively. The AI MAC-V used 2 displays simultaneously. The azimuth tube showed left-right positioning. A blip appearing on the left side meant the target was toe port. Right side meant starboard. The elevation tube showed up-down positioning using the same principle. The operator's job was to call out corrections that would center both blips, bringing the fighter directly behind and slightly below the target. Starboard 10 to gear. Steady, climb 200 ft, range 3 m closing. The pilot would follow these verbal instructions blindly, trusting his nav completely until the range closed enough for visual contact. By 1942, AI MAC-V entered service, and this system was genuinely revolutionary. It incorporated automatic frequency control that eliminated much of the manual tuning required with earlier sets, making it more reliable and easier to operate under combat stress. The displays were clearer, the range was better, up to 5,122 miles, and the minimum range dropped further. Combined with improved training programs that turned radar operators into specialists as skilled as the pilots themselves, AI MCVT transformed night interception from an occasional success into a systematic killing process. The technical specifications sound dry, but the impact was profound. A German bomber cruising at night now appeared on British radar screens when it was still 5 miles away. More than enough distance for a skilled crew to maneuver into attack position. The fighter could approach from below and behind outside the bomber's defensive blind spot, guided entirely by electronic signals invisible to the target. The German crew would have no idea they'd been detected, tracked, and targeted until cannon shells started hitting their aircraft. The hunter had become invisible, not through stealth but through technology that operated in a spectrum the prey couldn't detect. 2 aircraft dominated Britain's night skies and became the stuff of nightmares for German crews. The Bristol Beaufighter and the de Havilland Mosquito. These weren't just good planes with radar bolted on. They were purpose-designed killing machines that combined speed, firepower, and electronics into packages that German bombers simply couldn't survive against. The Beaufighter entered service first in late 1940, and it was brutally effective. This twin-engine heavy fighter packed 4 20mm Hispano cannons in the nose and 6 303 machine guns in the wings. Enough firepower to shred a bomber in a single firing pass. Maximum speed was around 320 mm, fast enough to catch the Hankley 111s and Yonkers JW-88s that formed the backbone of Luftwaffe bomber forces. But what made the Beaufighter truly deadly was how well the AI radar integrated into its design. The radar operator sat directly behind the pilot with his displays clearly visible, able to communicate instantly through the internal intercom. This tight physical arrangement meant faster decision-making and smoother coordination during the critical moments of an intercept. Wing Commander John Cunningham, flying Beaufighters with 604 Squadron, demonstrated exactly how devastating this combination could be. On the night of November 19, 1940, he scored his first radar-assisted kill, a Junkers Ju-88 that never knew what hit it. By May 1941, Cunningham had 15 confirmed night victories, all achieved through radar-G-guided interceptions. His radar operator, Flight Lieutenant Jimmy Ronley, was equally famous among crews. Ronley could read his radar displays like sheet music, calling out corrections with calm precision, even when closing at combined speeds exceeding 500 km/h. Together, they proved the concept worked. A skilled team with good equipment could find and destroy bombers reliably in complete darkness. Then came the Mosquito in 1942, and it raised the bar even higher. Built almost entirely of wood to conserve strategic materials, the Mosquito was fast. Maximum speed over 380 mph in night fighter variants, making it one of the quickest operational aircraft of the entire war. It carried the same 4 20mm cannons as the Beaufighter, but in a sleeker, more aerodynamic package. The crucial advantage was speed differential. A Mosquito could catch anything the Luftwaffe flew at night and could disengage at will if threatened. German bomber crews reported being overtaken by aircraft they never saw, hit from behind and watching their attacker disappear into the darkness before defensive gunners could even traverse their weapons. The Mosquito NFT-10-2 and later variants were specifically optimized for the night fighter role. AI Mach 4 or Mach 8 radar fits seamlessly into the nose with the operator positioned perfectly for instrument monitoring and communication. The cockpit layout emphasized crew coordination. Pilot and navigator sat side by side, able to glance at each other's instruments and maintain constant verbal contact without shouting over engine noise. This seemingly minor detail made enormous differences during high-stress intercepts when split-second decisions determined success or failure. Statistics from 1943 and 1944 show the impact clearly. Mosquito and Beaufighter squadrons were claiming multiple kills per mission regularly. Squadron leader Branse Burbridge flying Mosquitoes with 85. Squadron became the RAF's top scoring night fighter pilot with 21 confirmed victories between 1943 and 1944, every single one achieved through radar-guided interception in darkness. His observer, flying officer Bill Skelton, was the eyes that made it possible, calling out positions while Burbridge flew. The Germans had no effective counter. Their bombers were slower, their defensive armament inadequate, and they had no idea how the British were finding them. They just knew that something fast and deadly was hunting them with impossible accuracy. Understanding how these invisible killers actually worked requires walking through a typical intercept from start to finish. Let's follow a Mosquito crew from 85 Squadron on the night of March 3, 1944. Squadron leader Burbridge and flying officer Skelton hunting over occupied France. The mission begins on the ground at RAF West Mailing in Kent. Intelligence reports indicate a German bomber stream assembling over northern France, likely heading for targets in southern England. Burbridge and Skelton climb into their Mosquito Anyphon around 2200 hours. The aircraft is painted matte black, barely visible even under the airfield lights. They run through pre-flight checks, Skeleton powering up the AI MKX radar and confirming the displays are functioning properly. The twin Rolls-Royce Merlin engines roar to life and they taxi out into the darkness. Takeoff is instrument only. No runway lights, no visual references, just glowing dials and the throttle pushed forward. They climb to 22,000 ft in orbit over a designated patrol area, waiting for ground controllers to vector them toward contacts. The radar displays show ground returns below, cluttered and difficult to interpret, but Skelton watches them carefully, looking for anything that moves differently from the stationary landscape. 20 minutes pass. Radio crackles. Nighthawk 23, we have trade for you. Vector 270, Angels 20, range 15 miles. Ground radar has spotted something. Burbridge banks left onto the new heading while Skelton adjusts his radar gain and searches the displays. At 12 miles, the ground controller calls another correction. The target has changed altitude slightly. Burbridge adjusts. At 8 miles, Skelton sees it. A faint blip on the azimuth displays lightly left of center. Contact port 5 there, slightly above range 7 mi. His voice stays calm despite adrenaline flooding his system. This is the moment everything depends on. Losing the contact now means starting over. Burbridge makes a gentle turn left while Skelton watches the blip strengthen. Range 6 miles. Port Tudor climb 300 ft. The pilot adjusts smoothly, trying to position the Mosquito directly behind and below the target. The classic stern attack position that keeps them in the bomber's blind spot. Range 5M centered where slightly low still. Climb 200. Their relative positions are critical now. Too steep an approach and they'll overshoot. Too shallow and the closure rate drops, giving the target more time to take evasive action if they somehow detect the threat. Range 4 miles centered matched altitude. Burbridge throttles back slightly, controlling closure speed. They're moving perhaps 40 mph faster than their target. Fast enough to close steadily, but slow enough to maintain control. Range 3 miles, drifting starboard slightly, correct. 5 to right. Tiny adjustments. Now the blip on Skeleton's display is strong and clear, centered on both tubes. Range 2 miles, perfect position. You should have visual soon. Burbridge strains forward, searching the darkness ahead. Nothing yet. Range 1 mile, still nothing. Range 3/4. And there it is, a darker shape against the slightly lighter sky. Rectangular wings and twin engines. Hankel 111. The bomber is completely unaware, cruising steadily on course. Burbridge eases the throttles back further, matching speed exactly, closing the final distance to 400 ft. The H-11 grows larger in his gun sight, solid and vulnerable. His thumb moves to the cannon trigger. 4 Hispano cannons erupt simultaneously. 20mm shells, crossing the gap in less than a second. Bright flashes appear along the bomber's fuselage and wing roots as explosive rounds detonate on impact. The German pilot reacts instantly, throwing his aircraft into a desperate diving turn, but it's far too late. More shells tear through the cockpit area. An engine catches fire, orange flames streaming back across the wing. The He-111 rolls inverted and begins spinning downward, pieces breaking away. Burbridge doesn't follow. Standing orders are to break off immediately after attack and look for new targets. Skeleton confirms the kill, watching the burning aircraft spiral toward the ground 12,000 ft below. Elapsed time from initial contact to destruction, 4 minutes. The bomber crew never saw them coming. The Germans weren't passive victims. They fought back desperately with every technological and tactical trick they could develop. The problem was that they're fighting blind against an enemy whose core advantage they couldn't fully comprehend or effectively counter. The first German countermeasure was the Kanakos radar detector deployed in late 1943. Kanos worked by detecting emissions from British AI radar sets, giving bomber crews warning that a night fighter was searching for them nearby. In theory, this should have helped. A warning tone in the headset meant taking immediate evasive action, diving or turning hard before the fighter could complete its attack. In practice, NACS had crippling limitations. The detector could only pick up radar emissions at relatively close range, often giving crews just 30 seconds to a minute of warning. By that time, a skilled British crew had already positioned perfectly and was seconds from firing. Even worse, NACS generated frequent false alarms from ground-based radars, training crews to ignore warnings until it was too late. Luftwaffe Leutnant Martin Drews, One of Germany's top night fighter pilots later wrote about interrogating downed RAF crews and being astounded by British radar capabilities. We had assumed they were using some version of our own radar technology, perhaps slightly improved. When we learned the true sophistication of their systems, the range, the resolution, the integration with the aircraft, we realized we were technically outmatched. The Germans had their own airborne radar, the few G2 Lenstein, but it was bulkier, shorter ranged, and less reliable than British equivalents. More importantly, German radar was designed primarily for their own night fighters hunting British bombers, not for warning bomber crews about incoming threats. The Luftwaffe tried tactical solutions as well. They implemented wild boar tactics, wild St. German, where single-engine fighters would patrol over target cities using searchlights and fires on the ground to silhouette British bombers. This worked occasionally against RAF Bomber Command's raids on Germany, but did nothing to protect German bombers attacking Britain. Since British night fighters operated in complete darkness using radar, not visual identification, the tactics were fundamentally mismatched to the threat. Schrieger music, slant music, German slang for jazz, was perhaps their most effective defensive innovation. This involved mounting upward-firing cannons at an oblique angle, allowing night fighters to attack bombers from directly below where defensive gunners couldn't see or shoot. German night fighters using Schrieger music achieved devastating success against RAF heavy bombers over Germany. But again, this was an offensive weapon for German fighters, not a defensive tool for German bombers. A few German bombers experimented with downward-firing defensive guns, but installation was difficult, and the tactical benefit minimal. By the time a bomber crew knew they were under attack from below, they were already being hit. Some German units tried flying at extreme altitudes above 25,000 ft, gambling that British night fighters would struggle with performance at those heights. The Mosquito simply followed them up. Its service ceiling exceeded 36,000 ft, and the crews were trained for high-altitude intercepts. Other units tried flying extremely low, hoping to blend into ground clutter on British radar. This was more effective, but came with its own deadly risks. Flying a heavy bomber at 200 feet in darkness over unfamiliar terrain killed more crews through navigation errors and accidents than it saved from night fighters. The fundamental problem was that Germany was reacting to symptoms rather than addressing the disease. British night fighters weren't succeeding because of superior tactics or braver pilots. Though both helped, they were succeeding because they possessed a technological capability the Germans couldn't match or counter. British AI radar gave them information dominance in the night sky. They knew where German bombers were. German bombers didn't know where the fighters were. No amount of evasive maneuvering or defensive armament could compensate for that basic formational asymmetry. The Germans are playing a game where their opponent could see the entire board, while they were limited to their own pieces. In such circumstances, defeat wasn't just likely, it was mathematically inevitable. By mid-1944, Luftwaffe bomber losses to RAF night fighters had become unsustainable, contributing to the near-complete abandonment of strategic bombing missions against Britain. The psychological toll of fighting an invisible enemy proved as devastating as the physical casualties. Luftwaffe bomber crews had endured years of brutal combat. They'd faced Soviet fighters over the Eastern Front, flown through Mediterranean flak, survived missions where half their formation didn't return. But those were comprehensible dangers. You could see flak bursts watch for enemy fighters take evasive action when tracers stree. The night war over Britain was different, and it broke men in ways traditional combat never had. Unteroffizier Hans Roth, a wireless operator on June 88th, described the mounting terror in his diary entries from early 1944. "We've lost 3 crews this week to the night ghosts. No warning, no chance to fight back. Mears' plane just exploded. One moment it was there in formation. The next moment a ball of fire falling from the sky. We didn't see what hit them. Nobody ever sees what hits them." The randomness was psychologically devastating. In daylight combat, skill and vigilance improved survival odds. At night against RAF hunters, there seemed to be no correlation between competence and survival. Experienced crews died just as suddenly as novices. The phenomenon created what modern psychologists would recognize as learned helplessness, a state where individuals feel they have no control over their fate and stop trying to influence outcomes. German bomber crews began displaying symptoms of severe combat stress at rates far exceeding other units. Medical officers reported dramatic increases in stress-related breakdowns, psychosomatic illnesses, and requests for transfer. Some crews developed superstitious rituals before missions, specific prayers, lucky charms, elaborate pre-flight routines, desperately trying to impose some sense of control over an uncontrollable situation. Completion rates told the story in hard numbers. By late 1944, roughly 40% of scheduled German bomber missions against Britain were being aborted before reaching targets. Crews turning back, citing mechanical problems, weather, navigation errors, any excuse that might be accepted. Investigating officers knew many of these were psychological failures rather than legitimate equipment issues. But what could they do? Court-martial exhausted men for being terrified of an enemy they couldn't see or fight. The Luftwaffe High Command tried rotating crews more frequently, reducing mission loads, offering extended leave. Nothing helped significantly. The fear was too fundamental. Wing Commander Bob Graham, another top-scoring RAF night fighter pilot, observed this deterioration during interrogations of shot-down German airmen. By 44, the prisoners we captured were frankly terrified, not Office particularly, but of the night itself. They described feeling constantly watched, constantly hunted, knowing that at any moment something might emerge from the darkness and kill them before they could react. Some were almost relieved to be out of it, even as prisoners. The breakdown extended beyond individual psychology into unit cohesion. Bomber crews depended on mutual trust. Pilot, navigator, wireless operator, and gunners, working as synchronized teams where each man's life depended on the other's performance. But when death came randomly and unavoidably, that trust eroded. Gunners knew their weapons were useless against threats they couldn't see. Navigators couldn't plot courses that avoided the invisible hunters. Pilots had no defensive maneuvers that reliably worked. The crew became a collection of individuals waiting helplessly for fate to select them, rather than a team fighting together for survival. Luftwaffe bomber effectiveness collapsed accordingly. Even crews that reached targets were often too rattled to bomb accurately, dropping payloads early or wide, and fleeing back toward friendly territory at maximum speed. Mission debriefs from late 1944 describe formations scattering at the slightest alarm, every crew assuming they were being stalked by unseen hunters. The RAF's night fighter force, numbering fewer than 40 operational squadrons at its peak, had effectively neutralized the entire German bomber threat through a combination of technological superiority and psychological warfare. The Luftwaffe could replace aircraft faster than they were shot down, but they couldn't replace the shattered confidence of crews who'd lost faith in their ability to survive the night. The invisible war fought in darkness over Europe between 1940 and 1945 fundamentally changed how nations think about air combat, and its influence extends directly into how fighter aircraft operate today. What the RAF pioneered with AI radar and night fighters wasn't just a tactical innovation, it was a complete paradigm shift that established principles still governing aerial warfare 8 decades later. The core lesson was information dominance. The side that can detect the enemy first, track them accurately, and approach undetected holds an almost insurmountable advantage regardless of other factors like speed, maneuverability, or firepower. Modern air forces obsess over this principle. Every advanced fighter aircraft today, the F-22 Raptor, F-35 Lightning II, Eurofighter Typhoon, is designed around sensor fusion and situational awareness. Their radar systems, infrared sensors, and data links serve the same fundamental purpose as the AI McVeight radar in a 1944 Mosquito. Find the enemy before they find you. Maneuver into position while they're unaware. Strike before they can respond. The technology is exponentially more sophisticated, but the operational concept remains identical. The human element established by RAF night fighter crews also endures. Modern fighter aviation emphasizes crew resource management, the structured cooperation between pilots and weapon systems officers. This traces directly back to pilots like Burbridge and Branse, working with their radar operators, developing communication protocols and trust under life or death pressure. Today's F-15E Strike Eagle crews or FA-18F Super Hornet teams train using methodology refined from those wartime lessons. The technology changed, but the necessity of seamless human coordination did not. Stealth technology represents another evolutionary branch from the same root. If British night fighters succeeded by being undetectable until the moment of attack, modern stealth aircraft like the F-22 and B-2 Spirit take this further, by being undetectable even during the attack itself. The goal remains unchanged: Deny the enemy information about your presence, position, and intentions while maximizing your own awareness of the battle space. It's the same philosophy that made the Mosquito terrifying to German bomber crews, amplified by 70 years of technological development. The Germans' failure to counter British night fighters also taught lasting lessons, mostly about what doesn't work. You cannot compensate for technological inferiority through bravery or tactical cleverness alone. The Luftwaffe had superb pilots, sound doctrine, and considerable combat experience, but none of it mattered against an opponent who possessed fundamental sensor advantages. Modern military powers invest enormous resources, ensuring they maintain technological edges for precisely this reason. The American defense establishment's focus on maintaining superiority in radar, electronic warfare, and stealth capabilities stems partly from understanding what happened to German bomber crews in 1944. Competent forces can be rendered helpless by adversaries operating in domains they cannot access. The psychological dimension influenced military thinking as well. The concept of morale damage through technological mystery, making the enemy feel helpless against incomprehensible threats, appears in modern doctrine around cyber warfare, drone strikes, and electronic attack. When adversaries cannot understand how they're being targeted or devise effective countermeasures, the psychological impact often exceeds the physical damage. This was true for German bomber crews who called RAF night fighters the invisible enemy, and it remains true for insurgent forces facing modern precision strike aircraft. Perhaps most significantly, the night fighter campaign demonstrated that smaller technologically advanced forces can defeat larger conventional ones through information warfare. The RAF never had numerical superiority in night fighters. Total aircraft committed rarely exceeded 300 against Luftwaffe bomber forces, several times that size. But technology multiplied effectiveness to the point where numbers became irrelevant. This lesson shapes current military investment priorities worldwide. Quality over quantity, information over firepower, precision over mass. These principles dominate modern air power thinking, and they trace directly back to mosquitoes and Beaufighters hunting German bombers in darkness over wartime Europe. The invisible enemy of 1943 became the template for every advanced military force today. We're all trying to be the hunter in the darkness and desperately trying not to be the prey.